So welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about deep learning. And there's a lot of super awesome people who have helped contribute to these slides, and they're acknowledged here. So first we're going to talk about supervised learning with neural networks, basically introduce the concepts of perceptrons, of layers, of activation units, and so on. And then, just the very basics of learning about gradient descent, backpropagation, learning rate, dropout, overfitting, just foundations from basically the 60s. And then we're going to talk about unsupervised learning with deep belief networks and how to start learning representations using autoencoders. Then we're going to talk about modern deep learning architectures, focusing a lot on convolutional neural networks and recurrent neural networks, and also transfer learning and generative adversarial networks. And we're also going to talk about deep learning specifically in the field of regulatory genomics, where this has actually been very powerful. And then introduce to you guys some computational infrastructures that you can use in your own projects. So first of all, as we start thinking about learning, the first question is, hey, we are learning machines. We are growing up in a complex world and we're able to see. So as you start looking at this picture, the question is, what do you see? What are the primitives that you see? You might see trees, you might see buildings, you might see people and cars, and you're not thinking about individual edges. You're not thinking about sort of, these low-level pixels. You're not thinking about shades of color. You're really thinking about objects. So your brain is clearly doing something there to sort of abstract away all of these low-level details to learn how. You see a hand, you can immediately read Fourth Avenue and so on and so forth. So there's something that goes on inside your brain that sort of, extracts meaning from all of these primitives. And one way to understand what goes on inside your brain is to actually start looking at some visual illusions that actually kind of break these, primitives. So if you see here, what do you see? You see a bunch of muffins, or actually, wait, no, you see a bunch of little dogs. Or wait, some are muffins and some are dogs. And I don't know for you, but my brain actually hurts when I'm trying to figure out which ones are muffins and which ones are dogs. And that's probably because your primitives are sort of fighting against each other. And it's the same thing here. If I ask you what do you see, well, you probably see a bunch of bagels. I mean, that's clearly a bagel, that's clearly a bagel. Or wait a minute, no, that's a little dog. And is this a dog or a bagel? It's hard to tell. So again, your brain is sort of has combating primitives fighting for attention. What if I show you this one and I tell you, well, clearly this top blue line goes up to the right and this one goes up to the left and so on and so forth. But what's really weird is that, no, these lines are actually parallel. And if I show you these squiggly line here going all around, yeah, that's clearly a squiggly line. And if I show you Marilyn here, you might say, oh yeah, of course, that's a picture of Marilyn. But in fact, what's actually happening is that these lines are parallel to each other. These circles are perfectly concentric. And Marilyn here is actually, if you squint, is Marilyn. But if you look really closely, it's Albert Einstein. So your brain is clearly fighting between all of these different cues that it's grown up to recognize. And again, in terms of having your brain hurt, there's a lot going on in this picture. But basically, what's really going on is that a computer has basically reused primitives from other places to construct a picture from somewhere else. So this is actually a person looking at you, and when you squint, it looks like a normal person. But as you sort of zoom in, it's very problematic. So the question is, how is your brain actually messing all these up, and what actually goes on inside the primitives of your brain? So a lot of the early work on neural networks was inspired very much by our budding understanding of the architecture of the visual cortex, and all of these things that we've been talking about, and all of these sort of conflicting signals that are happening inside our brain are very much at the core of our very motivation for initially machine learning and neural networks, and now deep learning. So every time you look at an image, that image gets projected through the lens of your retina, And then this, gets projected back into a series of cortical layers that are interpreting initially your primary signals, and then higher and higher orders of abstraction. And your visual cortex is actually organized into layers that are basically looking at higher and higher, uh, you know, combinations of the lower layers. And you can think of the responses that are happening at each of these levels as sensors for particular types of features. So you can actually have spatial frequency responders, orientation tuning responders, contrast responders, and so on and so forth, that are actually at the basis of your visual perception. And of course, low level, if you actually ask what is happening at the level of individual neurons, you basically have these synaptic connections where neurotransmitters are being released. And if there's a sufficient number of these molecules crossing a barrier, you basically have a sufficient number of signals that are crossing a particular activation threshold, added up through all of these inputs to the same neuron, the same neuronal cell. And all of these inputs are basically adding up the amount of transmitters that they have detected, and eventually making a decision at the cellular level to fire or not. And these decisions are basically made at every one of these cells, but across an actual neural network, a human neural network, you basically have networks of these neurons connected to each other, adding up these signals and then making threshold decisions for depolarization, and then sending off their signal to now the synapses. And inside your visual cortex, there are actually, responses that are happening at different layers of abstraction. So as I mentioned earlier, you can have edge detectors and bar detectors and, center versus periphery detectors. And those are arranged at increasing layers of complexity with, higher layers of your visual cortex, capturing higher levels of abstraction, of orientation, disparity, color, some basic shapes, some curvatures, and eventually complex features and objects as you get to these higher levels. And this is not just true of your visual cortex, this is also true of your motor cortex. So your motor cortex has similar layers of organization with, multiple layers of abstraction. And this is true for your, auditory cortex. For, most of the learning features inside your brain are in fact, exploiting the same architecture. And if you look at what is that architecture doing, that architecture is simply effectively a general learning machine. So this neocortex that went from, our siblings, more or less the mice, to our, twins, basically the, chimps and the macaques, to this dramatic increase in brain size. And I like to show this picture because, I mean, of course, this is one of the most successful humans on the planet. But having no hair also helps you appreciate the huge amount of stuff that goes on above the eyes. So if you look at, the chimp skull, there's this, nice little space here. And if you look at the human, you basically have this massive expansion of hardware that, happens above the eyes. So here, you kind of stop at the top of the eyebrows. And then for humans, you have this massive expansion. So basically, to the chimps, we kind of look like the aliens from Mars Attacks look to humans with this massive cortical expansion. And this is very much the same type of architecture. It's sort of this neural network with multiple layers of abstraction and sort of, increasingly complex features and abstractions being learned. And that machinery has basically evolved a long time ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, well after we separated from chimps, obviously, but then heavily selected, and hasn't really changed that much in the last, 10, 20, maybe even 50,000 years. So we've basically captured huge areas of science without any dramatic changes to the hardware because of its generality. What has changed is the huge amount of knowledge that we infuse our children during these malleable periods of, I don't know, the first 18, maybe even 24 years, where you guys are just like, taking classes nonstop and just getting, all of these different layers to sort of, train on increasingly complex abstractions, which is very unique to the human species because we don't have to fend off enemies, very rapidly. So what deep learning does is that it exploits this concept of multi-layer architectures with the computational framework to actually learn abstractions that are reused at multiple layers and multiple levels and multiple nodes throughout this network. So the way that we can think of recognizing these images is that there's a visible layer, which is the input pixels, and then there's a hidden layer and another hidden layer and another hidden layer that are all feeding information to each other, very much similar to the layers of our visual cortex. And these layers, let's see, there's a chat question. Did you change your microphone? Can you guys hear the microphone well? Can you guys hear me? Is it really deep? Is it okay? No, it's fine? Okay, good.
Yeah, it's a little deep and it comes and goes sometimes.
I see. Yeah, so I can switch to this microphone. Can you guys still hear me now? Yeah? Okay, good. So why don't I switch to that one? And, oh, it's better. Okay. All right, so basically these, these visible layers now connected to an edge detector, which is then connected to a corner contour detector, which is building all these edges, and then a parts of an object detector, which is building all these corners and contours, and ultimately an object identity, which is based on these object parts. So that's where deep learning really gets its name, the multiple layers of representations that are being learned. And you can think of representation learning as not just hand designing features, but actually learning the features and learning the mappings for the features. But then the concept of deep learning is that we're not only going to learn these features, but we're going to build additional layers of more abstract features that are learned from more simple features. So if you look at this hierarchy of AI includes, for example, knowledge bases. Machine learning is more statistical. That's where logistic regression, for example, fits in, rather than just humans encoding a lot of knowledge. Representation learning can basically build on these logistic regressions and other types of statistical learning, and have some kind of shallow representations. And what deep learning does is, for example, the multi-layer perceptrons and so on and so forth, they have these additional features of learning features and having layers of abstract features. Okay, so you can sort of see this increasing layer of complexity there as well. So the question has always been, how do we humans recognize images of, I don't know, 20 by 20 pixels or 64 by 64 pixels? So how do we take a bitmap and then learn that these are all 2s and this is probably a 4 and that's probably a 7 and so on and so forth? So the whole concept is that perhaps what humans are doing deep down is the same that we can do at the machine level. So maybe we can design these neurons, these artificial neurons, that receive inputs the same way that our neurons receive inputs, and then decide whether a threshold has been crossed to sort of send out an output with some kind of linear function that basically says that the output is going to be some sum of all of the inputs, each scaled by some weight. Okay, so that's sort of the most basic artificial perceptron. And then a biological neuron is not that far off from that. And what a neural network does is that it stacks up these artificial perceptrons to basically capture these multiple layers of abstraction. And the sort of key insight beyond these initial designs of a linear function is that beyond the linear function, we can actually have a thresholding for that activation layer that happens inside our brains
that allows us to learn non-linear functions. So the concept here is that this function is purely linear, and therefore we can't really capture the complexity of the world around us that requires a lot of thresholding, a lot of sort of, you know, max functions and XOR functions and so on and so forth, which can't be easily learned using these linear functions. But instead, what we can do is use some kind of thresholding. For example, a sigmoid unit is something that was used in the early days of machine learning for mapping from this 0 to 1 with a threshold of saturation. So if you're, you know, below 0, you know, the neuron doesn't fire, it doesn't respond, and eventually it sort of saturates and sort of goes to full response. Okay, so that was the first type of approximation of what happens inside our brains with the sigmoid unit. Another way of thinking about this is perhaps it doesn't saturate at 1, perhaps it continues increasing, it's just 0 for a while, and then, you know, at some point there's this activation threshold, and then the more you feed it afterwards, the more it fires. And that's this soft plus unit that basically, again, starts out at 0 and then eventually smoothly transitions to this more linear function. And then another, you know, much more simple and much more commonly used now type of nonlinearity is this rectified linear unit, or this ReLU. So what this ReLU does is hard max. Basically, it's instead of having a soft function, you basically have a hard function that is 0 until you get to some level of activation threshold, and then simply matches the input thereafter. Okay, so these types of nonlinearities suddenly expand the expressivity of these neural networks dramatically and allow you to learn a huge, you know, family of functions. So how do you learn with these functions? The way that you learn is that you adjust the weights. So let's think about one layer at a time. So basically what I would like to know is how well I can match the output function all the way up here of what is the desired output. If the desired output is, oh, I'm seeing a cat, or I'm seeing a dog, or I'm seeing a person, or I'm seeing a car, that's the desired output. Okay, so it's a 1 or a 0, or it could just be some, you know, scalar. You then want to adjust the weights so that whenever the set of functions, the set of inputs that are supposed to be lining up for the dog, for example, match, then I predict a dog. The way to do that is to actually look at the gradient, look at the difference between your desired output and your actual output for a given input. So for every input I have the predicted output given the current set of weights and the desired output given the current input. Is everybody with me so far? So what I can do is basically take the difference between the two and adjust my weights to best match that difference. And the way that I adjust the weights can be, you know, a hard way, or it could be a soft way. I could basically look at the gradient of how is the weight changing relative, or how is the error changing relative to the weight, and then adjust the weights along that gradient. Okay, so that's what gradient-based learning does. It basically says, here's the delta, here's the error between the desired outputs and the current output, and I'm going to take the partial derivative of that error function relative to the weight that I'm currently adjusting. And I'm going to adjust the weight at time t as a function of the weight at time t minus 1 with some change that I'm going to be applying. And that change is going to be some, you know, epsilon, which is going to be the learning rate, times this derivative relative to the gradient. Okay, the derivative relative to the weight, which is basically the gradient, with potentially some additional weight decay that basically tells me how fast is that weight decaying as I go through, which basically forces me to learn smaller parameters over time so that, you know, the initial weights don't just explode. And then potentially some momentum, which is using the previous change to guide me so that I don't sort of sharply jump back and forth and miss that optimal, okay? So what gradient descent does is that it takes the partial derivative of the error, which is the desired output minus the current output with respect to the weight, you know, adjusted by some learning rate, which is needed to not overshoot the optimal solution, some weight decay, which penalizes large weights to prevent overfitting, and some momentum, which is based on the magnitude, but also the sign of the previous update. When the direction of the update is consistent, you basically have faster convergence. When it's inconsistent, you sort of don't jump too far around it. And you know, this is the traditional gradient-based learning. Stochastic gradient-based descent is speeding up the computation by randomly sampling the subset of samples and then updating the weights using only that subset. So using only a subset of samples, I can actually have either stochastic gradient descent or even online learning, where I'm updating the gradient using only one training point each time. So this is basically the typical approach of you carry out first a forward pass that tells you what is the output Y and what is the desired output. And then you do a backward pass, a backpropagation, which basically looks at what should have been the weight here, what should have been the output there, how should I adjust the weights, and for each of those intermediate nodes, I continue propagating this back, where I'm basically taking the derivative of the weight of the error with respect to this KL weight, with respect to this JK weight, and so on and so forth, okay? So what the update rule does is that it sort of continues updating at every layer of the network, from the closest to the furthest from the output, okay? So the way to think about this is that what you're looking at is how that error surface changes with respect to your weights. In a one-dimensional way, you can basically say, well, if I increase my weight, then my error surface, goes higher. And if I decrease my weight, it also goes higher. So what I want to do is follow the direction of the derivative and then decrease my weight if I'm to the right of this, or increase my weight if I'm to the left of this. And of course, I'm not updating one weight at a time. I'm updating multiple weights. So you can think of, a multi-dimensional space of errors that I'm traversing. And then I have constraints from every training example that are pushing me in specific parts of the space. So provided that the objective error function is concave, at every iteration, the error derivatives will decrease the distance between the current weight vector from every local optimal solution. And by a finite number of updates, the weight vector must reach one of these local optima. So, if the local optimum is here, where I can no longer improve the weight, I will eventually get there through this iterative approach. So the learning rate is basically extremely important, and there's many additional challenges for convergence. So for example, if the optimal solution space is very narrow, you'll end up with a very slow convergence because you're going to be jumping all around it. If the learning rate must also be small to not overshoot the optimal solution, so you might sort of just jump there every single time. And then the numerical approximations of the gradient can basically take steps in slightly incorrect directions, and bigger steps can simply miss it altogether. And of course, there's a huge challenge of overfitting because we have a lot of parameters and usually very few training examples. So large networks basically take time to train, and they need bigger steps, and they can also shoot in all the wrong directions. And the architecture sometimes must also be learned. So that's learning the weights here, but you might also want to learn hyperparameters. For example, how many hidden layers should I have? How many hidden units? What should be my learning rate? Maybe the learning rate itself should be a parameter, a hyperparameter that I'm learning, and the weight decay factor, and so on and so forth. So one of the most important concepts in deep learning to realize is the whole concept of training error versus generalization error. So your training error is the error in your actual training set. So you can basically fit your parameters to better and better and better approximate that training set. And eventually you'll get just very, very close at approximating it. And that decay in blue tells you that your code is working, that the system is actually learning. But the problem is that the better you can approximate your initial examples, the worse you will actually start approximating your new cases. And the reason is that beyond just learning a set of functions that is general, you're now starting to learn the particularities of the example that you showed. For example, if you learn, how to recognize, I don't know, President Obama based on his dark shirt, you might sort of see another picture where he's wearing a lighter shirt and sort of say, oh, well, that's not him anymore, because after learning some features, I kind of overfit that particular jacket that he was wearing, okay? And that's the reason why, number one, you want to avoid training for too long over time. And number two, you want to distinguish a training set from a test set that basically tells you at what point do I start, predicting incorrectly. And the problem with that is that if you choose the stopping point based on the minimization of the error of the test set, you will then need another place to actually validate how well does that do more generally. So what we usually do is use a validation set for stopping, and then a test set which is completely held out for then knowing how that decision to stop affects the overall performance in yet another training set, which is another evaluation set, which is the test set. So basically, we usually leave out a small validation set, which is not used to train. It's used to evaluate the model, and you basically have this validation cross entropy that decides when to stop, and you stop when this validation cross entropy increases to prevent overfitting, and then you look at your overall performance in the test set to do that. Okay, so the more you learn, the better you will fit that function up until some point where your generalization error will start increasing. Another way to avoid overfitting is using regularization by keeping your parameters small, or by, namely your weights, keeping your weights small, and that's sort of where the weight decay, for example, can come in, or by keeping the number of weights small. And one way to actually keep the number of weights small is to actually just randomly drop some intermediate nodes in your network. So again, we talked about regularization last time. We talked about linear L1 lasso regularization, quadratic L2 ridge regularization, and their combination of elastic net on the parameters. And what dropout does is that it achieves this parameter minimization in deep learning by randomly dropping hidden units with different input points with some probability P. So you're basically saying, well, instead of having a fully connected network, I'm going to throw away some of these. And that will force my network to not overly rely on any one of those intermediate nodes. So you're basically training a subnetwork by backpropagation as usual. And this is equivalent to a bootstrap aggregation approach or a bagging approach that has an exponential number of models, each of which is missing some nodes. And it provides a very powerful regularization method that avoids overfitting in general. And the reason for that is this intuition that what you're actually doing is, enriching your family of models, each of which is using a slightly different version of those weights. So what dropout allows you to do is go beyond, the local minima where some previous methods were stuck, and now go further down in your minimization of error. Okay, so usually deep networks are pre-trained by generative models, and if your y-axis is the testing error continues to decrease even after non-dropout training is reaching the plateau. And non-dropout training is probably getting stuck because it has now put so much weight in some of the nodes that you can't just get out of the local maxima that these nodes allow you to do. But with dropout, you sort of force yourself to take a hit initially and move out of those local maxima, but then that allows you to reach a higher, local maximum. So these are some basics of supervised learning with neural networks. So basically, we introduced the basic foundational introductions of how our own brain works, and then these layers of learning, these activation units through sigmoid, soft plus, ReLU. and gradient descent, stochastic gradient descent, online learning, backpropagation, the rate of learning, dropout, and also how to avoid overfitting. So let's do a quick poll. So how well are you guys following so far? Okay, so this is lovely. Okay, so let me go briefly through these parts to basically get at some of the more modern architectures. But the next sort of progress in this deep learning is the whole concept of learning these representations in an unsupervised way. So if I have a fully connected network that basically has some visible units that are connected directly to the inputs and some hidden units without necessarily having an output unit, I don't have now an output that I'm trying to learn. I just have a set of relationships that I'm trying to learn. So these are basically a general Boltzmann machine where everything is connected to everything else, where the visible units are connected to each other and the hidden units are connected to each other. So this, this generalized Boltzmann machine is basically a universal approximator of probability mass functions over discrete variables. So you can basically learn these relationships de novo. A restricted Boltzmann machine basically takes away the connections between these hidden units and between these input units, which allows you to actually learn these features more generally. So it's a bipartite graph, and there's no connections between those. And there's only one layer of hidden units and one layer of visible units. And it's a very simple unsupervised learning module where you're basically learning these relationships through these different functions. So stacking these restricted Boltzmann machines allows you to now start learning layers of representations at higher and higher levels of abstraction. And again, all of this is trained simply based on these relationships learnings rather than a particular output function that you're trying to match. So you can basically now ask, if I let this stacked RBM loose on a set of characters, what is it actually learning? And if I sample now from this over multiple generations of learning, it will basically start approximating these functions, even though it was never actually trained to learn those. It was just exposed to them. And there's a lot of features of learning these RBMs, but also much more generally useful for learning, which is this concept of a thermodynamic interpretation of your learning rate. So you can think of these local maxima as basically needing some activation energy to get over these barriers that separate them. And if I include a lot of noise in the system, it will be able to jump over those barriers, but eventually it will never actually stop at any one of them because the activation energy will be too high. So one idea is this simulated annealing that basically cools down the temperature as you move forward and as you progress through various epochs of learning in your system to effectively allow you to get out of these local maxima early on. But eventually, once you've reached one of those deeper local maxima, you can no longer jump out of them because this temperature of the system has now cooled down, effectively making it harder to jump back out of them. So that's what simulated annealing does. It basically changes this temperature and then it controls the stochasticity of the transition. You can also train by Gibbs sampling by updating all of the hidden units in parallel, or updating the visible units to get a reconstruction and then updating the hidden units and then going back and forth. So we talked a little bit about Gibbs sampling a couple of lectures ago to basically get at this whole concept that instead of trying to learn a joint function across everything, I can just learn parts of it each time. And instead of approximating the entire posterior distribution, I can sample from that posterior distribution without actually fully reconstructing it. So another way to get at this is phases of wake and sleep where you're basically clamping the visible units with data or unclamping the visible units from data to basically allow you to get out of these local maxima to sort of incorporate the data and effectively having a sleep or a dream phase where you're now letting just the hidden units sort of generate output and you know, learn these relationships between them, and then reclamping the visible units to sort of start feeding these data again. So that's for unsupervised learning with these deep belief networks that allow you to learn representations without necessarily having output function associated with them. Now, there's another way to learn representations without having a training function by tricking this supervised learning architecture into an unsupervised learning architecture, into behaving like an unsupervised learning architecture. So the idea is the following. With an autoencoder, you basically have a set of input variables where the output variables are exactly identical to the input variables. So you have an image of a cat, and you're trying to learn a representation of a cat without ever telling it these are cats and these are not cats. But the way that you're doing this is that you're giving as the output image the same input as the input image. So you're trying to predict the full image of a cat using the full image of a cat. That's trivial, right? I can just take all of the pixels and then, you know, output the same pixels that I receive. And that would be trivial if I had, you know, thousands and millions of pixels and millions of intermediate nodes. But the key idea of an autoencoder is that it imposes a bottleneck whereby my input has to be summarized. It has to be compressed into effectively a representation, which is then expanded back out to match the output image. So you're basically tricking a supervised learning algorithm to work in an unsupervised fashion. You feed the input as the output function to be learned, but you constrain the model complexity. So you can pre-train these with you know, RBM, as we saw earlier, to learn representations for future supervised tasks. And you can use the RBM output as data for pre-training the next layer. And after the pre-training, you could unroll your RBMs to create this deep autoencoder. And you can, again, fine-tune it using backpropagation from this. So one way to learn these representations is to force your model to sort of learn these layers of abstraction even in advance, or by simply, you know, creating this bottleneck in the middle. Okay, so who's with me so far? You guys following well? So let's see. So what we talked about is supervised learning and unsupervised learning, but also the sort of halfway between supervised and unsupervised using these autoencoder functions. So we have 53, 37, 550. That's awesome. So the next major innovation has been with convolutional neural networks, and specifically learning convolutional filters and these pooling and sum max filters. So convolutional neural networks really changed the world in 2012 with this paper in a series of papers where you know, these image competitions were always won by these hand-tuned features and, you know, all of these sort of non-machine learning approaches, and then non-deep learning approaches. Basically, the key transition was when AlexNet basically scored an error that was 10% lower than the runner-up, and that was one of the earliest applications of these convolutional neural networks. Okay, so this whole idea in this image representation learning is that computers basically, you know, don't see an image of Lincoln here. All they see is a series of pixels. And these series of pixels is basically just one giant array of numbers. So with an image of, you know, just 255 pixels, for example, or 1,000,000 pixels for just a very small image nowadays. And the question is this Lincoln, is this Washington, is this Jefferson, is this Obama? And how can the computer answer this question? So the idea is, how can I do classification on a million long image vector directly? And the answer is, of course not. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to exploit the spatial structure of the image to learn patches and then build up these patches. And again, this goes back to our visual cortex, the fact that the recognition features are exploiting the local structure of the way that the neurons are connected near each other to be able to recognize on-center versus off-center firing, to recognize edges based on the relative firing of pixels nearby, to be able to recognize shadows and so on and so forth in order to build up these primitives. So then how do you identify features in these images? How do you find a nose, eyes, and mouth, wheels, the license plate, the headlights, doors, windows, and steps? So the traditional approach of the field of machine learning and AI was that we're going to handcraft features. I'm going to learn primitives of windows, and somebody's going to code in and sort of see what windows look like. But what modern deep learning does, and what these convolutional neural networks do, is that they learn the features themselves de novo. And the key insight here is that these convolutional filters are going to be applied throughout the image. So I'm going to be learning this throughout the image. So therefore, a patch of a window that I learned here will also be applicable to a patch of a window that I learned there. A wheel feature that I learned here will also be applicable to a wheel feature that I learned there. So basically, by learning these representations and these features, i.e. these convolutional filters jointly across the whole image in this sort of parameter sharing approach, I'm going to be able to learn these representations directly. So how can you produce these feature maps? So, Photoshop has for a long time had these filters where you can basically sharpen your image. What's sharpening? Sharpening is basically taking the middle pixel, subtracting the surrounding pixels, and then that increases the contrast and the intensity. Or you might want to build an edge detector, which basically says, if there's difference here between the positive and the negative, that basically means that every single time I traverse a shading that changes from light to dark, then this feature is going to be firing and therefore detecting the edges that way. So if I basically have an input image like this, and I use even a 2-pixel filter like that, where it adds up the number of the value of the pixel here, and it subtracts the value of the pixel there, every single time I have, very high intensity pixel and a very low intensity pixel, that filter is going to be firing maximally. If I have just black to black, it's not going to fire at all. If I have white to white, it's not going to fire at all. But as soon as I transition between black and white, it's going to be firing either positively or negatively based on the specific type of transitions that I'm making between black and white. Is everybody with me here? Yeah? Awesome. So you can basically build these very simple kernels, i.e. filters, in this way. You can basically, handcraft them. Or you can basically start now learning these convolutional filters de novo. You can basically learn these types of filters de novo. And the idea here is that I'm going to be sharing parameters as a set of convolutional filters that I'm going to be learning as global hyperparameters throughout my image. So the convolution allows you to share parameters across your entire image. So here's a 3x3 convolution on a 5x5 image. So what does the convolution do? It basically adds up the pixels according to that filter and computes a single output. Okay. So if I have 301, 262, 241 as my input, I can then pass that through this filter, and that filter is some kind of edge detector here. You can see the positive, negative. It basically will add up all of this. So -1 times 3, 0 times 0, 1 times 1 for the first row, plus -2 times 2, 0 times 6, 2 times 2, 4. And then the last one is, 2 times -1, 0 times 4, and then 1 times 1. So I'm adding all of that, and I get a single number, which is how well did that convolutional filter score at that position. Okay, who's with me so far about this whole sort of matching a filter to a part of an image by scanning it through? So convolution is basically combining multiple numbers together, and deconvolution is obviously the opposite. And what I'm doing now is that I'm combining multiple pixels together through a filter to compute the output function of that. So 65, 24, 660. So basically that's what this convolutional filter does. It's the same transformation applied to different locations of the image, and in matrix form, it's simply, applying this, throughout. And this convolution is made of multiple copies of this image, and it's sparse because it only applies to small regions. And I can sort of have a sliding filter or a many-to-one filter, which is using, for example, the R, the G, and the B channels of a RGB image, and so on and so forth. And these filters must apply to the entire depth of the image, so they end up reducing the size of the image. And then I basically have a pooling layer, which is either taking the maximum or the mean, that simply says, did I detect an occurrence of that feature anywhere in my image, in this patch of an image? Okay, so this is basically what this convolution operation is doing. It's sort of going through and computing this and detecting all that. So the key idea of these convolutional neural networks is that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be learning not just the weights, but also a separate set of filters. So I'm going to be learning the weights, but also the filters. And this hierarchy of filters, this hierarchy of handcrafted features, is learned directly from the data rather than hand engineering them. Okay, so that's the key insight of this convolutional neural network. So basically, number one, I'm going to be learning the structure of the image, where nearby pixels matter, and it matters that they're nearby because they construct patches. Number two, I'm going to be learning layers of abstraction. And number three, at each of these layers, I'm going to have a set of separate features which are shared throughout, which are effectively enabling me to learn. So these low-level features are going to be learned de novo, and these are the features that are actually learned. If you look at low-level features at the lower layers, and then the mid layers and the high layers, these are visualizations of the actual features that are learned. And you can see here that, there's dark spots and light spots, and these are effectively edge detectors. And then you start seeing sort of particular patterns combining these edges, and these are actually starting to match eyes and ears and noses. And then if you look at the high-level features, they basically start matching different parts of the faces, okay? And all of that is learned de novo. So this is what this, dramatic transformation of deep learning has done. It basically said, okay, great, let's start with an input image, and then we're going to apply some convolutional filters, and I'm going to be learning the filters directly from the data. And then I'm going to be subsampling those and then applying more convolutions and subsampling those and applying more convolutions. And this is basically creating these layers of abstraction. So over here, I'm learning edges, and over here, I'm learning contours, and over here, I'm learning, parts of objects, and over here, I'm learning objects, okay? And then after I've extracted these multiple layers of features and annotated the different patches of my image based on whether those features occur or not, then I go back to the traditional machine learning and sort of these traditional neural networks that basically have a fully connected layer where I can basically learn how to predict whether it's a bus or a cat or a person by combining these features that I've learned at each of those layers, okay? So who's with me on the whole architecture of these convolutional neural networks that basically starts at the bottom, learns progressively more abstract features by learning a separate set of reuse parameters for those features, and then applying those in a fully connected layer at the end to effectively make whatever prediction you would like to make. All right, so 4456,000. Okay, so basically, a typical image classification task will start with the pixels of your image, learn convolutions, and then carry out this pooling operation. And this pooling operation is combining information from multiple places together to say, hey, did this occur anywhere in that patch? Because frankly, as you're trying to recognize a face, it might not matter exactly where the eye was positioned. Even if the eye is slightly to the left, slightly to the right, slightly above, it's still an eye, and it's still in roughly the right spot. So these, pooling layers allow you to be invariant to these transformations. And then convolutions on the pooling, and then pooling on the convolutions, and so on and so forth, learning these abstractions, and then classifying at the end. Okay, so you basically have feature extraction and then classification. So the way to think about these networks is that you basically have a depth, a height, and a width. The height and the width is dependent on the pixels of your image at every layer of abstraction. And then the depth is basically how many of these convolutional filters am I applying. So I'm going to look for up-down edges. That's one depth. Then the next depth might be down, left-right edges. The next one might be circles. The next one might be contours, and so on and so forth. So basically, I'm learning many of these filters and I'm stacking them on top of each other. And then all of that is, the full information that I'm going to be pushing to the next layer. And then, of course, this nonlinearity is going to be allowing me to say, did anything happen here, rather than, worrying about all of these negative numbers that would then not allow me to be able to abstract away. So the challenge, of course, is that as I'm learning these features, there's a lot of variability in the images and in any data set that I'm learning on. So there's a lot of scale variation. There's a lot of deformations, a lot of occlusions, a lot of variations within classes, or there's a lot of background clutter. And the viewpoint through which I'm seeing a face might actually change, and the illumination might actually change. So how do I correct for that? There's two ways to correct for that. One way to correct for that is to basically have a complete coherent model of the world that basically tells me how are features of the world going to change if I, take the lighting away, for example, if I take the deformations away, or if I take the viewpoint away. So perhaps I could infer a 2D to 3D function that learns what, that this is truly a statue with a nose and eyes and mouth and so on and so forth. So that's one way. And some models of human cognition are basically saying that what we're actually doing is learning 3D models in our head. That's one way to interpret it. Another way to interpret it is that our brains are simply being exposed to faces from every possible angle. And we have this massive neural network, this massive deep learning network that allows us to recognize faces despite all of this variation. So one way to do that is one way to let machines do that is to actually expose them to pictures of cats by deforming them artificially, by sort of regenerating slightly, occluded version, or, by sort of taking the pictures of a bus from 100 different angles. And then it's going to learn how to recognize a bus from this angle, and from that angle, and from that angle, and from that angle, and from that angle, as opposed to learning some kind of true 3D representation. So the feature invariance is usually achieved by feeding that machine a ton of perturbations and then letting that machine learn the same object through many different types of perturbations. So who's with me here on this concept of, instead of trying to reverse or annihilate these perturbations, I'm just going to create more and more perturbations so that my system can learn the representation regardless of what specific perturbation I am looking at. Lovely. Sounds great. So, so again, these are just the typical layers, and there's been a lot of evolution in these, deep neural networks, in these deep learning networks. So the initial one had basically, a huge number of features for what we thought at the time. But again, this was dramatically increased by subsequent layers, so by subsequent learning approaches that basically dramatically increased the number of layers. So basically, AlexNet, for example, had 8 layers, VGGNet had 19 layers, and these numbers of layers increased dramatically. GoogleNet, for example, had 22 layers, and then these ResNet had just huge numbers of layers, creating a problem where variations in my input might have tiny little effects in the variations in my output. So that's a problem that we're facing in genetics that we're going to start talking about next week. But this is a huge problem where there are so many different layers where it's very hard to now do gradient descent across all of these different layers. So what ResNet introduced is this whole concept of feeding these residuals across these networks and jumping over these layers. So across these layers, you can basically feed additional information that allows you to now make the learning more efficient by having some additional information there. So and again, there's been countless applications of these approaches through medical imaging, for example, and breast cancer screening, where you can now start letting the machines recognize features of images that are having a breast cancer and that don't have a breast cancer, and then being able to recognize these features by having the machine perhaps notice things that a radiologist might actually not notice. So this is, on the convolutional neural network side, this whole concept of applying these convolutional filters and pooling through this sum and max in order to be able to extract these translation invariant features, but also altering the inputs as a way to sort of get at position invariance, lighting invariance, and other types of invariances. So the other type of architecture that is pervasive and also extremely useful in genomics is recurrent neural networks. And that's the goal. The goal there is to learn linear or temporal relationships. So the concept of these recurrent neural networks is that they have inter-time dependencies with each time step sharing parameters with the next time step. So for example, these dependencies might include the value of the hidden unit or the value of the output of the previous stage. And this is extremely important in any kind of temporal data set. So if you're understanding speech, or if you're translating language based on written words, or when you type on your phone and it sort of predicts the next word, all of that is based on these recurrent neural networks. So what is the idea of the recurrent neural network? It's that at every time point, for example, as I'm writing the first word, the second word, the third word, I have a function that is dependent on both the previous value and the current text that I'm entering, okay? And a very compact way of representing this is through this box here, which basically says that this network is a temporal network which I can unfold over time, okay? So these recurrent neural networks can basically propagate information across different time steps. And you can have different types of architectures for propagating this. This might come, the previous information might come from the hidden unit, or it might come from the output unit, or it might come from the input unit, or it might come from, some intermediate node that I'm learning, or it might be the delta between the output unit and the previous prediction. The idea is that at every time point, you can basically finish your computation and then have an input ready for the next time point. So one way to achieve learning with this is to always just try to predict the, previous, basically the right answer of the previous time point, for example. So to always make a prediction for everything you see, and then to validate that prediction based on the next thing you saw. So this allows you to basically self-train these temporal recurrent neural networks by simply always trying to make a prediction about what's the next thing that's coming, and then updating my model of the world based on how off I was from that prediction. And that effectively gives me infinite training data. But the concept here is that I might actually see something earlier on that allows me to now predict something after some time steps, okay? So the problem with that is that as I increase the distance in between the early time steps and the late time steps, this becomes increasingly difficult because there's this vanishing gradient problem that I mentioned earlier. But now instead of the layers being stacked on top of each other, the different variables are stacked horizontally next to each other based on longer and longer time points. Is everybody with me as to sort of what the point, what the challenge is here? So basically, the same way that we were previously trying to learn across many, many different layers, and we had trouble because we couldn't propagate information, we're now trying to learn over many time points, and the gradients basically become vanishingly small and vanishingly less dependent of the original input. So the way to address that is that you can basically create these long short-term memory modules. And what is a long short-term memory module? It's a module that is basically able to decide whether it wants to learn or not, and that can propagate a memory that it has learned, and then decide whether it wants to keep this memory or not in the previous time point. So you can basically have a forget gate that basically simply says whenever the input is such that I decide that I no longer want to remember this, I can just simply forget it away. Or I can have an input gate that basically says, oh, now I want to learn something new, so I can sort of now remember that in this sort of propagation framework. Or I can have an output gate that basically says, well, now is a good time to remember the thing that I've been remembering all along and to reuse it for the next time point. So these long short-term memory gates basically allow you to effectively have this non-vanishingly aspect, the non-vanishing aspect of your input, because the signal doesn't decay. At every step, I decide whether to fully remember the signal or to fully forget the signal. So you can basically propagate state in both directions by having a forward LSTM and a backward LSTM. And I can stack these LSTMs along with convolutional neural networks to basically, for example, learn videos. So in a video, I can have a convolutional neural network at every frame, which is basically learning a head, a person, a torso, and so on and so forth, while at the same time learning a sequence between the output of my convolutional neural network. And then the output of all that is a combination of a CNN and an LSTM through this RNN. Basically, I'm using this convolutional neural network, this long short-term memory module, and this recurrent neural network in a combined fashion. Is everybody with me here as to sort of the power of taking these primitives and combining them together? Awesome. 46, 38, 15, 0, 0. So remember earlier, as I was saying, that the next time point can depend on many different variations of that input. So here's some variations. So basically, I could have the next one depend on the output function or on the loss, basically the error function between the desired output and the actual output. I can have it, depend on, any of these combinations as I'm unfolding my network. So that's for recurrent neural networks, of how to learn these linear and these temporal relationships. Another two major innovations that I want to talk about, transfer learning and these generative adversarial networks. So what is transfer learning? Transfer learning is seeking to pre-train a particular model using a massive data set, and then finish learning using a smaller data set. For example, I might want to, study the brains of a small number of subjects that I spend a lot of money and energy gathering. And getting these, specific, drug responders in my clinical trial and doing, imaging on them might just be very expensive because I just don't have that many people in my clinical trial. But I have a lot of healthy subjects that I can apply the same technique to. So what I could do is offline, prior to getting my specific subjects, I can effectively learn a representation, through these convolutional neural networks and this fully connected layer for what healthy subjects look like in their brain more generally. And then when I get my very small number of targeted subjects, I don't have to relearn the entire stack of convolutional filters. I can just simply use transfer learning to learn to basically reuse the bottom layers of that architecture and guide my function using all this prior knowledge and classify a new function and then adapt it simply to the targeted subjects that I have. So when I get a new subject, I can basically classify that new subject using the representations that have been learned on a lot of healthy subjects and the classification that has been learned on a set of targeted subjects. So using these representations, I might be able to learn some kind of, softmax regression classification of blue points versus red points using everything that I've already learned and pre-trained on this sort of healthy data set. So basically, instead of just using deep learning the full way through on this tiny data set, I can basically use deep learning on a large public data set and then transfer these features and then only train my classifier at the end, okay? So, so you basically learn these intermediate representations, these abstractions from one task, and then you're transferring that knowledge to another task, which then requires many fewer training examples, and you reuse the features unchanged, or you do some small amount of adaptation of the features. So you could go back and readjust these convolutional filters a little bit if you would like. And then, this works across surprisingly, seemingly different domains because you're learning something about the natural world and something about these global features, okay? So who's with me so far on transfer learning, this whole concept of pre-training your network to learn these representations based on a large data set so that you can then go and only learn small parts that are residual in a very valuable, smaller data set. So 73-20-700. All right, so as for generative adversarial networks, you guys have probably seen them a lot in the news. So, this whole concept of this person does not exist, even though it looks like a perfectly normal person. So what's the idea there? The idea of these deep fakes, of this ability to sort of generate very photorealistic people, or in the context of genomics, very, biologically realistic data sets, is that you can create two different neural networks. One is a generator network that generates fake images or, gene expression levels similar to other gene expression levels. And then a discriminator network that tries to distinguish whether those fake images are fake or real. So you have first some kind of noise vector that you're feeding to your generator, and that generates a lot of fake images. And then you have a discriminator that basically says, oh, no, this image is fake, this image is real. And that discriminator is effectively what's teaching the generator to generate more realistic images. And then that allows the discriminator to get to improve the generator. So the generator gets better because it has a teacher, and that teacher is this discriminator network that says, oh, sorry, I can tell this one's fake. Keep trying. But at the same time, the generator network helps the discriminator network improve because it basically makes fake images that are closer and closer to reality. And therefore, the discriminator needs to get better at discriminating. So that's why we call them adversarial networks, because they're fighting against each other. As one is getting better, the other one has to get better. And as the other one gets better, the first one needs to get better. So supervised learning is very powerful, but it's expensive and it's hard to train. So the idea of these generative adversarial networks is that you can generate a neural network that provides the feedback instead of having humans basically tell it, well, no, that doesn't look too real. You have a network that gives that feedback. So if you couple the two, the generator and the discriminator, you can improve them both. And this was initially generative, and now you can have semi-supervised, but also reinforcement learning architectures based on that principle. And then there's many applications. You can improve images, you can improve data sets, you can create art and faces and 3D worlds and so on and so forth. So for all of you guys who are basically doing final projects that require a lot of data, one idea might be to actually create generative adversarial networks that allow you to generate additional data sets using features of the original data, but that allow you to sort of get more and more data realistic data sets. Okay, so who's with me so far on these generative adversarial networks and how they're working with the generator and the discriminator that are getting better at each other by having one of them catch the errors of the other, and then be used as the teacher. And as the student gets better at generating these more realistic images, the teacher gets better at distinguishing better and better those images. And then, you basically have the evolutionary process working. Okay, lovely. So 69, 23, 800. All right, so now that we have all of this infrastructure of supervised learning using these basic building blocks and backpropagation and these basic ways of avoiding overfitting, we have this unsupervised learning with these Boltzmann machines and these RBMs and the stacking of these RBMs into belief networks. We have these tools for Gibbs sampling, simulated annealing, these wake-sleep cycles, these energy-based approaches. We now have these autoencoders and this ability to do self-training and representation learning and pre-training. We have these convolutional neural networks that allow us to learn these separate functions and these convolutional filters that are going to be reused throughout the image at every layer of abstraction, including these pooling layers with sum or max that are basically allowing us to be transfer invariant or translation invariant. These recurrent neural networks that allow us to learn these temporal relationships unfolding through time, and these LSTM modules, these long short-term memory modules that allow us to now remember something for a long time and then reuse it when needed. And this transfer learning of being able to pre-train in a particular domain and then apply to a new domain, or these generative adversarial networks that allow you to generate more data like the data that you had before, for example, images or gene expression profiles and so on and so forth, using these two networks. We can now turn back to regulatory genomics and see how are all of these tools applying in the context of regulatory genomics. So the idea here is that my input data is going to be DNA or protein or gene expression profiles. And this input data is going to be fed to a low-level learning machine, which will then have higher and higher convolutional filters to eventually learn representations, which I can then use at the end through a fully connected network to predict whether, I don't know, a transcription factor will bind, or whether this region is a gene, or whether this element is rapidly evolving, and so on and so forth. Okay. So a traditional way of doing that in the context of genomics is to basically have, in the same way as I have an RGB filter, which basically tells me red, green, blue channels of the same image, to have a one-hot encoding of ACGT, where instead of having a single letter, I have a bit vector 4 times. So I have 4 bit vectors. At every position, that bit vector tells me if it was an A, T, T, A, T, C, C, A, C, and so on and so forth. Okay. So I can feed to my convolutional neural network one hot encoding of my input data that basically tells me which nucleotide did I see. So every dimension is, did I see an A, did I see a C, did I see a G, and so on and so forth. And then the convolutional filters can simply be the motifs that I'm learning from the data. In the same way that we learn these position weight matrices or these position-specific score matrices, these PSSMs or these PWMs, I can basically now have a matrix that I'm learning, quote unquote, on the side. And these are my convolutional filters that I'm going to be applying throughout my genome, throughout my genomic region. These are going to be my convolutional filters that basically tell me, did I recognize this particular motif here? So for example, the TG-TTT-AC motif is the TG-TTT-AC motif. And I can scan that motif at every position on my, 1/4 image, which is effectively my genome, and then see when did it match. And as that convolutional filter fires and basically says, yes, it did match, I can have my pooling layer that says, did that motif match anywhere within this 50 nucleotide block? And then I can have my fully connected layer that basically learns the binding of a transcription factor from an experiment, which I'm now learning how to predict from the sequence, okay? So who's with me here on how we can take these convolutional neural networks and now apply them to a genomic data set using this one-hot encoding approach, where we're learning these motifs, we're learning these convolutional filters in the same way that we learned our edge detectors and our eye detectors and so on and so forth. I can basically learn convolutional filters at every layer of abstraction, okay? So I basically have my input, my convolutions, my, pooling, and then one or more fully connected layers, and eventually predict whether that transcription factor binds or not, given the underlying sequence. And you can do that with a single task, or you can do that with multiple tasks. So for example, you can predict, will this transcription factor bind in this cell type? And will the same transcription factor bind in that other cell type? Or will a different transcription factor bind? Or you can predict multiple classes simultaneously. And why would I want to do that? The reason I want to do multitask learning is because the underlying motifs might actually be reused across my network. So then reusing them makes a lot of sense if I have the same alphabet that will then be reused. So we can basically learn these latent representations either at the DNA level or at the protein level. So we can basically learn representations of even 3D structures by learning from the amino acid sequences, particular combinations that are associated with particular functions, which are in the end learning about domains of these proteins. So here's one example by Frascaridis over at the Media Lab, who's basically learning these convolutional neural networks on the protein domain, and then predicting which proteins will be, for example, cutting DNA, or which proteins will be binding DNA, and so on and so forth, based on their domains. So all of this infrastructure is, has evolved a lot since these tools first came out. And there's a lot of tools that allow you to now create these deep learning models very cheaply. So there's a lot of libraries like Theano and TensorFlow and Torch that have automatic features for learning or symbolic differentiation and backpropagation. They allow you to compile for particular graphical processing units, enabling speedups that are stemming from these highly optimized and parallel implementations of these core neural network functions that are found in these GPUs. And there's high-level neural network libraries that wrap on top of Theano and TensorFlow that simplify neural net creation, such as Keras and Lesagine, and so on and so forth. And there's much more powerful GPUs and easily accessible cloud GPU computing, such as Amazon Cloud and Google Cloud. And there's much more sophisticated and powerful models that you can now combine to build your neural networks. So Avinci, a student in my group, basically built this very simple example to walk you through deep learning using Keras to build a one-layer convolutional neural network with a binary output. So you first import Keras, which automatically imports the ANO and TensorFlow. And then from Keras.layers, the convolutional, you import a 2D convolutional layer and a 2D max pooling architecture. Then you also import the sequential model, and then an activation, dropout, flatten, permutation, reshaping, time-distributed dense functions, and so on and so forth. So you then specify the input shape of your neural network. So you basically want, for example, a one-hot encoding of DNA with 4 letters. That's 150 nucleotides long. And then you decide that you'd like a particular CNN architecture, a particular convolutional neural network architecture with, say, 20 epochs, with a batch size of 1,000, with a pool width of 5, with a convolutional width of 4, with 15 convolutional layers, and then a particular filtering. You can then initialize your model using this sequential function. And then you can add this 2D convolutional filter based on the filters, the rows of the height, the columns of the width, and the input shape of 1 for 150. And that basically tells you this is a convolution 4x15 with stride 1 and 10 filters per convolution. You can then choose your particular activation layer. So this is a ReLU, a rectified linear unit activation. And then you can add pooling with pool width of 5, whatever you chose out there. And then you flatten that model, and then you output with dimension 1. And then you can use a sigmoid activation function, for example, because of a binary output of 0, 1, whereas your ReLU will not just simply stop at 0 or 1. It will just go to any kind of input function. And then you simply compile it with a particular optimizer and a particular loss function, for example, binary cross entropy loss. And then you fit the model using some data, which is your DNA data, and some output that basically tells you is the transcription factor bound here or not, with a particular batch size and a particular number of epochs to basically fit the model with these mini batches. And then your prediction is simply, after you fit the model onto your X and Y labels, you just predict based on the X with a particular batch size. Okay. So for those of you who are interested in sort of learning from DNA data, you can just adapt this code, and then you will be up and running and using this. All right, so what did we see today? We saw a lot of things across deep learning. So basically looked at the traditional neural networks. So for example, how do humans see, and what are these building blocks that we can build inspired by this human visual cortex of perceptrons and layers and activation units. We saw how we can do gradient descent, and then backpropagation, how to change the rate of learning, dropout, and overfitting. We saw how you can use unsupervised learning, not just supervised learning, with these deep belief networks and these autoencoders with Boltzmann machines, restricted RBMs, and these entropy-based learning functions. We saw simulated annealing and deep sampling. We saw these modern deep learning architectures of autoencoders, these convolutional neural networks and these recurrent neural networks, and also transfer learning and these generative adversarial networks. And then we saw some examples in the field of regulatory genomics and some tools that you can use for deep learning computing. All right, so who feels that they've learned stuff today? So let's see. Love it. Okay, so 46, 23, 23, 80. This is awesome. All right, well, thanks everyone, and then see you tomorrow for the panel discussions and the. Thanks everyone, bye-bye.